When you face a compelling opportunity to take action, fear lulls you into inaction, enticing you to passively watch its prophecies fulfill themselves. How do you live your life eyes wide open? It is a learned discipline. It can be taught. It can be practiced. I'll summarize very briefly. Hold yourself accountable for every moment, every thought, every detail. See beyond your fears, recognize your assumptions, harness your internal strength, silence your internal critic, correct your misconceptions about luck and about success, accept your strengths and your weaknesses and understand the difference. Open your hearts to your bountiful blessings. Your fears, your critics, your heroes, your villains, they are your excuses, rationalizations, shortcuts, justifications, your surrender. They are fictions you perceive as reality. Choose to see through them. Choose to let them go. You are the creator of your reality. With that empowerment comes complete responsibility. I chose to step out of fear's tunnel into terrain uncharted and undefined. I chose to build there a blessed life.
Hello there. This is AM by Gnostic Radio, an initiation by conversation into the dark corners of myth, magic, and meaning. A crash course in cult culture and conspiracy. A virtuous virus invoking and informing history, holiness, and heresy. Each week, I, your host Miguel Connor, commandeers your connection to bring the most accepted and rejected scholars and provocateurs to your attention. Fun, compelling, and deeply weird, this is the blow-your-mind cocktail party conversation you always wanted to listen in. Always broadcast through the God above God dat can.
My father says that almost the whole world is asleep. Everybody you know, everybody you see, everybody you talk to. He says that only a few people are awake, and they live in a state of constant, total amazement.
Why are you here? Were you really meaning to click on Joe Rogan or Tim Ferriss on your iPhone? Why have you materialized at the virtual Alexandria? Simple. You are awakening from a bad dream where you thought you were an average human in a world that made sense with responsible leaders, a fair two-party system, social media and smartphones that weren't manipulating your perception and data gathering on you. A dream where you believed all the pain and suffering was part of a divine plan instead of a prison planet where you were eternally reincarnated into various amnesia-riddled monkeys. Now you have woken up and see the truth and greater destiny ahead of you.
I will not make any deals with you. I've resigned. I will not be pushed, filed, stamped, indexed, briefed, debriefed, or numbered. My life is my own.
Like J.R.R. Tolkien once wrote in his poem, Mythopoeia, blessed are the legend makers with their rhyme of things not found within recorded time. It is not they that have forgot the night, or bid us flee to organized delight. In lotus isles of economic bliss, forswearing souls to gain a Circe kiss. And counterfeit at that, machine-produced, bogus seduction of the twice seduced. Such isles they saw afar, and ones more fair, and those that hear them yet may yet beware. They have seen death and ultimate defeat, and yet they would not in despair retreat, but off to victory have turned the lyre, and kindled hearts with legendary fire, illuminating now, and dark hath been, with lights of sun as yet by no man seen.
I wish none of this had happened.
So do all who live to see such times, but that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us.
Well said, JRR, and this encompasses the ethos of AM Bite Gnostic Radio. However, we are not discussing Tolkien in this episode, but the Gospel of Philip. No, not Dick has been the theme these last few months, but the Valentinian work found in the Nag Hammadi library. This Gnostic Gospel is certainly brimming with mythopoeia and Gnosis and the cosmic caffeine to make sure you stay awake. Make sure you're always got that expression and attitude Forrest Whitaker had in Fast Times at Ridgemont High during the football game, while you play for keeps against the Archons and their Spicolis in the establishment. And stop being continually possessed and terrorized like Will from Stranger Things.
All I need are some tasty waves, cool buzz, and I'm fine.
Not only do we explore the depth of the Gospel of Philip, but also a new and wonderful translation. It's by Dr. James Brantingham, from his new book, The Gospel of Philip, a New Translation. James provides some wonderful breakthroughs and insights to this Gnostic work, as you will be privy to in our interview. All of this will keep you awake and the legend maker you were meant to be. Many of you have told me it's hard having Gnosis, taking that red pill suppository. I completely understand. As we open our eyes after getting out of Plato's cave, including the third one, not only do we see the world as the meat and soul grinder it really is, we detach, and our ego begins to wage war against our ability for serenity. You could say we become depressed, bordering on nihilistic, as we see the futility of matter and the blatant lies of social constructs. I've been there and been almost suicidal. Reminds me of the saying, whom the gods would destroy, they first make mad.
A beautiful morning. Poseidon has blessed our voyage. Sometimes the gods bless you in the morning and curse you in the afternoon.
But I say to you, if you're there, don't give up, as Peter Gabriel and Kate Bush sang. Hang in there, because that's the, quote, disturbing part Jesus tells Thomas in the Gospel of Thomas. There is the, quote, amazing part, if you keep going, where in all the darkness you begin to see the lost sparks of wisdom and begin to gather them. Begin to live in service of the least of your brothers and high art that forge your life as a legend maker. Again, hang in there. Things will get better. Hang in there until the miracle happens, which means you'll find purpose and meaning, and your sharp sense of humor will be more than for coping, but for psychic flight.
As Hemingway said, there is nothing noble in being superior to your fellow man. True nobility is being superior to your former self.
And what if you could go back in time and take all those hours of pain and darkness and replace them with something better?
Let me quote from James's book this passage from the Gospel of Philip, which I think puts it all into perspective and is one of my favorites. Truth did not come into the world naked and understandable, but through types and images, allegory and symbol. The world cannot receive it in any other way. There is rebirth and an image of rebirth. Rebirth through image is not enough. Without trusting in his divine salvational knowledge, attaining spirit, and undergoing rebirth, literally being born again, no one will enter the kingdom of God. Flesh gives birth to flesh, but only the spirit gives birth to a being with spirit. Flesh with spirit. Through this, the bridegroom enters the bridal chamber and becomes the image of truth. By this rebirth, we rise again to act and live, so as to imitate his image and likeness. Accepting death of the old life, we arise and resurrect anew. Born again, we are renewed and live.
You will always be a child of two worlds. I'm grateful for this, and for you.
This is all the price of freedom, of Gnosis, of liberation. I recently heard Jordan Peterson talk about how when scientists tag zebra in a herd with paint or an RFID chip, the same zebra will be immediately recognized and killed by lions. In short, identification gets the zebra killed. Individuality gets the zebra killed.
Mother Nature is a serial killer.
Nature kills individuality, from animals to humans. And the predators, those lion-headed beasts as the demiurge is depicted in Gnostic writings, will come after you. It's woven into the fabric of the cosmos. That's another price of Gnosis. So be prepared with your Forrest Whitaker attitude, armed with your humor and empathy and just damn fine reason. And some succor from the aeons. Certainly the wisdom of the Gospel of Philip will help. So let us do our interview with James on his new translation. What matters, in the end, is that you write your own gospel and live your own myth. This is the Aeon Byte interview, and with us we definitely have the pleasure of being joined by James Brantingham to discuss his new book, The Gospel of Philip, a New Translation. How are you doing today, James?
Very good. Thank you, Miguel.
I really appreciate you being here. Obviously, as we've discussed before, this is sort of a mutual favorite gospel of ours. But let's start with you. Tell us a little bit about your journey and how you became interested in this text, culminating with you writing this book.
Well, thank you. I began to develop an interest in reading about Christian history, and that was probably back especially in the early 1980s. And I also developed an interest in reading about Judaism and a lot about things that related to Christianity in general. Eventually, I looked at, I believe it was Funk's text or book. I think that was the first time I came into contact with the Gospel of Philip. I can't remember the exact year, but somewhere around the early 1990s, I came into contact with, I think I'm pronouncing this correct, Jean-Yves Lelou's.
I can never pronounce his name either. I've read his work too, and I love it. But yeah, same boat.
I think I read his Gospel of Thomas first, and I was for the very first time very impressed by that text. And shortly after that, I noticed that his Gospel of Philip was for sale. And I don't know if I'd enjoyed it as much the first time that I read it quite a long time earlier. Anyway, I purchased his book, Jean-Yves Lelou's Gospel of Philip, and I read that. Now, when I read that, I found that moved me at times. I can't exactly put my finger on it, but it seemed deeper to me than the Gospel of Thomas. That may sound silly, but for whatever reasons, I enjoyed it very much. And my history, that just then established my keen interest in things called Gnostic. And I think somewhere around that time, I bought Robinson's, or sometime later, I bought Robinson's first full translation of the Nag Hammadi text, slogged through that. Later on, I got Meyer's Nag Hammadi, which I found quite a bit improved in the translation and readability. It began to enjoy other texts besides the Gospel of Thomas and Philip, and I read through that complete Nag Hammadi writings. So then I came into contact with the Gospel of Mary. I came into contact with the Gospel of Truth. And I had bought a number of other editions of the Gospel of Philip, I believe, like by Andrew Philip Smith. I bought the Apocryphon of John. I think that was by Davies. I think it's Davies.
Yeah, Stephen Davies. Yeah, great book. All great books you mentioned, but keep going.
And so I read many fine translations of the Gospel of Philip, and many excellent authors that wrote about the Gospel of Philip, or did their own translations of the Gospel of Philip. But two things, maybe three things, made me finally decide to attempt writing my own translation. And one of those things was, and this is no disparagement of any of these other excellent authors, I had a tendency when I was reading in their books to pencil in a word that I would have chosen rather than the word they used, or half a sentence here or there. And again, in no way am I putting down others' translations of the Gospel of Philip, but that was one thing I ended up doing, scribbling notes in Laloux's book and Davies' book and other well-known authors like Barnstone and Myers, and it just, it was a thing I did, and they are all excellent translations. So it's just telling my story. On the other hand, I remember two other things that happened. I wasn't really aware of Patterson Brown's translation of the Gospel of Philip, and I came across that, and that had an extraordinary effect on me. He also had his Coptic to English interlinear text there, which I used, and but his Gospel of Philip moved me more deeply than any other translation or edition that I had read before. And shortly after that, I think the Gospel of Thomas by Lynn Bauman came out, and I thought Bauman's Gospel of Thomas text was very beautiful. And those three things, my scribbling, my coming across Patterson Brown's book, and the Gospel of Thomas by Bauman, somehow made me decide, well, you know what, I'm essentially retired, and I have to keep my mind involved and active with things, even though this has not been my professional vocation. But I wanted to try my hand at coming up with my own Gospel of Philip, which I hoped would be an excellent text that would be accessible even to people that didn't have a Gnostic background, or maybe reading it for the first time, it would be easier for them to read it and understand it, and just try to produce something a little bit similar to what Bauman had done with his Gospel of Thomas. Of course, this sounds a little bit outrageous, but that's what got me going, and I started in on it. I also wrote a huge book to begin with, because I wrote all about I annotated every single verse, and one of my sons is an attorney, and he's not only brilliant, but he's also a wordsmith. And I asked him to look at the book, and he just about ripped out 90% of it, which I'm grateful for. So we just corrected one verse, a couple of verses today, and I admitted in the introduction that okay, I better be open about this. I did some of my own exegesis, but let's face it, I did a little bit of eisegesis too, in trying to bring out what I thought was the meaning of each verse, as I'm calling it. And of course, I'm using the word verse, and it's you know, and I know that it's not just the sayings of Jesus Christ. There's some sayings of Jesus Christ, and it even says Jesus said. However, a lot of the statements or paragraphs or a few sentences and so forth, nobody's quite sure exactly what they are, as far as I can tell. I mean, there's a lot of different ways of describing what the Gospel of Philip is, and I kind of come to the conclusion that nobody's completely sure. To me, it seems like the Gospel of Philip is a kind of a wisdom or sapiential, I hope I'm saying that correct too, or sapiential gospel and kind of a sayings gospel at the same time, so a wisdom and sayings gospel. But this is just my idea regarding it. Certainly, sometimes 2 or 3 verses are linked, and then you might have 7 verses, each one after the other, that have nothing to do with each other. So it's difficult to say exactly what all of these verses, where they came from or what they are, but I did find them beautiful, and so I wanted to try producing my own edition. So that's what I did. A little audacious, but
no, I think you did a great job, and I enjoyed the book. I enjoyed the translations. I admit, when I first started getting interested in Gnosticism, the Gospel of Philip really spoke to me. I think I was making a transition from a Catholic into whatever I am these days, a heretic. So the Gospel of Philip really spoke to me. I've moved on to other interests or other Gospels that speak to me, mostly the Sethians and so forth. But what about you, James? Why exactly did you like this? Was it inspirational, scholarly, spiritual? Why exactly did it move you?
Well, it's hard to say exactly, but when I was still teaching at the university, I would, and I was doing clinical research, I usually would have an hour lunch break, and I kind of had the run of the last university I was at, and so I'd pick a room that nobody was in. I had my dean's approval for this and everything, and I would find kind of a table to lie on, and I would lie there and I would read the Gospel of Thomas a little bit. I would tend to relax and try to breathe in and out, and just kind of get refreshed, so that the second half of the day I could go at it. During that time, I would find that I would read the Gospel of Thomas, and then I think, well, I'd like to go a little deeper. I don't know why it was deeper for me exactly, but I would then pick up the Gospel of Philip, and then I would read a little bit from it, and then I would lay back and just breathe for a little while and relax, and then I'd go back to work kind of feeling refreshed. For me, it was better than jamming down a couple of cups of coffee or something like that.
Makes sense. Yeah. I mean, you found that fuel to, like you said, to get you through the day. Like John Lennon says, whatever gets you through the night, and this is what spoke to you. So why don't we get to the gospel itself? I know the $64,000 question I have for you, and I know you're prepared for this, is the Gospel of Philip Gnostic?
That is a very interesting question. I would say, if you read it on the surface, if all you do is read the words on the surface, it appears to be mildly Gnostic, and I think for many Christians that are canonically oriented, mainline or Catholic, they generally probably won't pick up any heresy when they read through it, or what they think would be Christian heresy. But when I read it, since I have read the rest of the Nag Hammadi text, and I read many books about the Nag Hammadi text and about individual books and so forth, I know that the Gospel of Philip can be read on two levels. So, often it says something like, the two will become one, or the two shall become one. Now, reading that as a Christian, you would just say, or as anybody, not just a Christian, a Jewish person or a person without faith. Nevertheless, if you read that two shall become one, sounds like a very common Judeo-Christian statement, where two people become unified in belief or two people become unified in purpose. But later on, reading through many other textbooks and reading many other books in the Nag Hammadi corpus and so forth, a little bit outside of the corpus, I came to understand that might mean joining an individual, a man or a woman, with their guardian angel, so to speak, and then who was an opposite sex androgynous individual, and the two would become one as a Zigi, I think it is. And so, on one level, you could read the Gospel of Philip and read it, and it would appear to be just mildly Gnostic in terms of the type of theology we see in the Apocryphon of John. And I think most people would not pick up on that unless they were really trained to, had read the Apocryphon of John and other books similar to that. Otherwise, if you do have that behind you, though, many statements in Philip can be interpreted through that, sometimes called mythotheology of the Gnostics. And so I would say it doesn't appear Gnostic on the surface, and I think it's very accessible to many people who don't consider themselves Gnostic. I purposely tried to write it so that it would not overwhelm an individual with Gnostic ideas. I know that Patterson Brown did not believe it was Gnostic, and he made a very strong argument. I'm sure you've looked at. And I know other major authors, I can't name them because they haven't come out openly and stated it in writing, who also believe it's not Gnostic. So my rather mealy-mouthed answer is on the surface it's mildly Gnostic and appears much like a canonical text. If you're aware of the overall mythotheology of the Gnostic text as a whole, I think you can see it as a Gnostic text. How's that for a terrible answer?
No, that's a great answer. And no, it's a great answer. And like you said, it's still up for debate. Some scholars wonder if there ever was a Gnosticism or where the Gospel of Thomas is Gnostic. And this debate continues. I mean, Gnostic scholarship, as most people might not know, is still pretty early. It's maybe we've got 50 years or less of real strong scholarship, and it will continue. For the audience that might not know, could you give them a little background on this text and the dating, where it was composed, what was the group behind it?
Well, as I understand from other scholars, it's the belief tends to be that it was produced in Syria, and part of the reason they believe that is there are some words derived from Syrian that they think are kind of a clue to it having been produced in Syria, but exactly where in Syria, and I don't, nobody seems to say, well, it was in this city or in that city. And it's believed, it seems to be pretty uniformly by the top scholars that this was the work of disciples of Valentinus. Is that how you? Is that what you call him?
I call him Valentinus, but your wording or vocabulary is as good as mine, as far as I'm concerned. We weren't there.
He's, of course, a very famous writer, and as many texts say, he was also recognized in Rome. I don't know what level he had achieved, whether he was a bishop or he was higher than that, but there's many scholars have written that he actually was voted on in terms of competing with others to be the Pope, and he lost, and he wasn't appointed the Pope, and at some point in time later he left. Now, he is supposed to have written the Gospel of Truth, or at least many people believe that he wrote the Gospel of Truth. And I do think there's kind of a trilogy of books. There could be more than that, for example, if we had all the text of the Gospel of Mary, but we don't seem to have that. So the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Truth, I think there's kind of a trilogy there that makes up the core of the initial Valentinus works, at least for me. And then there's many other interesting books in the Nag Hammadi writings, which I have read since. And it seems like every year I can read them and understand them better based on the material that I've read and so forth. But so disciples of Valentinus supposedly wrote the Gospel of Philip. And that sounds reasonable to me. I know that Patterson Brown, the great Patterson Brown, in my opinion, held a minority view that it was actually written by Philip. He felt it was the evangelist Philip who showed up while Jesus was still alive, I believe, and the apostle Philip was around. He was called the evangelist, Philip the evangelist, and supposedly is the person that first converted. I'm going to use I'll just use this term, the Queen of Sheba's emissary. He was reading the Old Testament or the Tanakh, and he asked Philip, I guess he was reading Isaiah, and he asked Philip, can you tell me what this means? And if that was the evangelist, he converted him on the spot. So maybe the first Gentile converted to Christianity. Patterson Brown believes it was written by Philip, and that some part of it was written almost immediately after 70 AD. I know most scholars disagree with that and generally think the earliest it was written was 150, I should say, Common Era, and to 250 Common Era. Probably more tend to look at it as written in 250 Common Era. I'm not quite sure myself. However, it seems to have knowledge. I feel like it relates back to the Gospel of Thomas. It relates back to other Nag Hammadi literature, like the Apocryphon of John. So my feeling is the Gospel of Philip as a whole, in its final redacted state, came after those books were written. Well, what do you think?
That's a good question. I'd have to really look at my notes to see. I think I would agree with the dating. I would put it probably more middle of the 2nd century. But for the listener, 2 things for you, James. One, again, so they know, is why is it called the Gospel of Philip? And why exactly do they think it came from Syria? I know the answer from the work of Einar Thomason, but again, I want the audience to understand this before we delve into the actual sayings.
as I understand it, he is the only apostle that's mentioned within the text, and as I remember reading it, that's true. And at the end of the actual Coptic is a statement, the Gospel according to Philip, and there is a verse also in there that talks about a woodworker, and now I'm not sure why that relates. Let me take that back. Anyway, that's the primary reason that's given, that he is mentioned. And when they found the Coptic, because they haven't found any Greek bits of the Gospel of Philip, when they found the Coptic, at the end of it, it does say it's a gospel by Philip, and they do think that it was whoever, somebody thinks, or some scholars think that was written in after. Nobody's quite sure, but and the only reason they could give on a concrete level was because only his name was brought up in, I believe, just one verse. Although it may be intimated as being him in the second verse. Patterson, Brown, and a few others say the apostle, and at least one of the other scholars writes in the apostle Philip. So I actually use his name twice because it is known as the Gospel of Philip, and virtually nobody believes that, except for Patterson, Brown, that, or at least that's what it seems. Nobody seems to believe in the larger scholarly community. There may be exceptions, that Philip actually wrote it. So that's what I know about it being named the Gospel of Philip.
And a lot of the sayings you use the word the adversary and so forth. And also another sayings you just put in archon. What was your decision in doing this in your translations?
Well, I felt that nowhere in the Gospel of Philip does it come right out and say Yaldabaoth or Yaldabaoth.
Right.
Which is the demiurge created by Sophia, or wisdom personified, or wisdom made concrete in the Gnostic literature. And so this demigod, this demiurge, Yaldabaoth, according to that theology, created the world as I understand it. And that we do find that, for example, in the Apocryphon of John, which I feel the Gospel of Philip does utilize, or did utilize, the writers in putting together the text. But it is, his name is not in the text, and neither is the word demiurge in the text. What is in the text is rulers, and I can't remember what exact word it was, why I chose adversary, but I do know, because of reading other literature that's often been labeled Gnostic, that the Yaldabaoth, the demiurge, transforms or is transmuted into an archangel later on, and eventually into the devil, and eventually is recognized later on as the god of this age, or the god of this world, as the Apostle Paul put it, which would be Satan, which is the Jewish word for an adversary. So I used that word, adversary, somewhat in the sense of Yaldabaoth actually being the god of this world, with a small g and quotation marks on either side of God, and I use that I think both at times for the word archon or archons, or also ruler or rulers. And I think that strikes, the average person reading it, a Jewish person, a Christian person would immediately associate that name with how it's used in the biblical text, and not necessarily immediately associate it with Yaldabaoth. I think many Gnostics, or those who are inclined towards Gnosticism and enjoy a Gnostic text and so forth, would read adversary and immediately think of Yaldabaoth. So I was being kind of in the manner of the Gospel of Philip itself. I was using a loaded word that has two meanings. On the surface, it's not controversial. If you know the history of Gnosticism and how important Yaldabaoth and Sophia was as the creator of Yaldabaoth and so forth, then you might look at that word adversary or archons, which is usually associated with not good leaders but bad leaders, and immediately think of Yaldabaoth and how archons and rulers are seen in Gnosticism as a whole. What do you think of that?
No, I think it's a very good point you bring up, James, and we should mention that if it's a Valentinian work, then it would be different than the traditional Sethian and Ophide and Simonian work that you find in the Secret Book of John on the origin of the world and so forth. And in fact, again, we go back to the scholar debate. Some think that the Valentinians were really never Gnostic. They were sort of their own Platonizing Christians. And in their mythology, as the church fathers tells us, Satan had a role, the demiurge had a role, and the demiurge wasn't seen as that negative. He was sort of the demiurge of Plato and the Neoplatonists. He was a useful character who would be redeemed at the end of the time, and Satan was also sort of below him, testing the subjects and so forth. So yes, you make a good case about the Valentinians, and also if we read the Gospel of Truth, Valentinus does say Satan, he does say the adversary and so forth.
Thank you for that. I'm aware from looking at your other podcasts and listening to you and so forth that you're deeply read in this material, and I'm humbled by your understanding of the depth of these things.
Oh, no. Just, your work is also very good, again, but there's so many texts, it's hard to get specialized on one, and your work on Philip is definitely very good, because, I'm also remembering a lot of my days of reading Philip, which has been years ago, so it's a great, not refresher, but, I'm getting new insights on it. So yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you. And that's one of the things about Gnosticism that I don't know how we successfully deal with it exactly. I know that the scholars have greatly struggled with the term Gnostic and Gnosticism because the texts are so varied in the Nag Hammadi corpus, outside the Nag Hammadi corpus, and therefore it produces great angst in many of the.
Agreed.
I know one scholar who I cannot name right at this because he hasn't given me an okay to bring it up, but he does not believe this is a Gnostic text, nor does he believe is a Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of the Truth, and and he's one of the top writers in the field currently. I hope I'm not giving him away or anything like that, but he does not believe these are Gnostic texts. As I said before, Patterson Brown doesn't believe they're Gnostic texts. I think, what you had to say that that the Valentinians were maybe significantly different from the Sethians, more oriented towards canonical texts, or maybe wanting to produce texts that were allowed them to continue to live aside the proto-canonical Catholic Church at the time. I mean, maybe that's part of the reason why Philip is, on the surface, more easily read by a Christian without them becoming immediately upset. Just like the Gospel of Thomas. I mean, there may be a few verses in the Gospel of Thomas which seem a little different, but 95% of the book, the average Christian who has no understanding of Gnosticism or has in their background Gnosticism is bad, will read it and say, this seems, this reminds me of the Bible, or I should say the Christian Bible.
Agreed. And it should be mentioned, even within the Valentinians were, you might say, individualistic. There were different Valentinian sects, and each leader was allowed to sort of give his own interpretation on the canon and come up with their own ideas. So it's a labyrinth going on in there. But it's also interesting, too, James, that in the Gospel of Philip, you may not have this Gnostic cosmology as you see in other texts, but again, it's a sayings gospel. But we do have a mention of Sophia, and that seems she was an important figure for the Valentinians, and isn't she an important figure in the Gospel of Philip?
Yes, she is. She's not mentioned every single time. Often, it's the word chosen appears to be wisdom rather than Sophia, which the word Sophia in Greek means wisdom, but she's definitely in there, no doubt about it, and that's what hooks, or that's part of what hooks the Gospel of Philip to the greater Nag Hammadi corpus, and she is. I believe it's clear in the Gospel of Philip too that Sophia is what we would consider to be the Holy Spirit, or what is commonly considered to be the Holy Spirit in canonical Christianity. And so Sophia plays an important part in the Gospel of Philip. And to me, this is very interesting because as you read many books about the Nag Hammadi writings, they often talk about the hostility of the Gnostics toward the Old Testament, towards the Old Testament God, which supposedly many Gnostics called the demiurge Yaldabaoth. And yet, here we have a figure from the Old Testament. I mean, Sophia comes from Proverbs and Psalms. Proverbs 8 is what a lot of people like to bring out. And in there, it talks about Sophia. It talks about wisdom. It talks about she. Right. She was with God, when He laid the mountains, and pushed back the seas, and using biblical language like that. So clearly, Sophia becomes a personification of God in the Old Testament, and she's an honored personification of a female personification of God. Many people would say that Sophia in the Old Testament is not quite real yet, but in fact she is an attribute, a feminine attribute of God, which is honored in the Psalms, in Proverbs, in Ecclesiastes, and so forth. And so if the Gnostics, again, I use that word with quotes on either side, hated the Old Testament, why did they make this personification of Sophia, this female personification, into a real deity, which I think first happens in making her concretely a real divinity? Seems to me that happens in the Gnostic literature, not quite in the Old Testament literature, but then she's taken that. They take that next step forward, and they make her an actual divinity that Gnostics apparently in antiquity and for sure today pray to as a real divinity. So it seems to me that the Gospel of Philip and the writers of the Gospel of Philip certainly didn't hate the Old Testament, and must have been highly aware of Proverbs and Psalms and other literature that mentions wisdom or mentions Sophia and occasionally uses feminine pronouns, she said, she did, and so forth and so on. So that's kind of my read on that. It makes me think of one other thing too. In the Gospel of Philip, I think the first person to say this, I may be wrong, but it was Andrew Philip Smith. He said, in the Gospel of Philip, God is one. And I agree with that, even though there's, as you pointed out, there may be allusions to Yaldabaoth in Gospel of Philip, but nevertheless, allusions or not, in the Gospel of Philip, the Shema is upheld. God is one, and so it's very mysterious how this supposedly hated Old Testament has figures that become so meaningful and strong.
I think you hit it on the head, James. I mean, the idea that the Gnostics or any of these sects hated the Old Testament is pretty much false. I mean, even in the argument is simply that they were interpreting it right. They were getting the original message. Even in the secret book of John, Jesus tells the Apostle John, well, no, just Moses got it wrong. I mean, and in the epistle of, in Galatians, Paul says, well, the angels brought the Torah to Moses, and we all know that the angels aren't perfect. So, the idea of the Gnostics, all the Gnostic groups really saw inspiration and really revered the Old Testament. They just came up with their interpretations. The other point, too, I'd like to say is I think you're right, the idea that Sophia, this figure of the Old Testament that stood with God, she probably was evolving into the Holy Spirit. We have the Gospel of Hebrews that actually says that the Holy Spirit is feminine. She is a female. Like you said, she's the female aspect of God. And then the other thing I'd like to say too is Valentinus, as far as we know, he only gets slammed after his death by church fathers. As far as we know, he was a prominent and respected member of the early Christian church. I guess people just sort of reverse engineered his teachings that suddenly became heretical by the 3rd century. So I think everything you said, James, is spot on. But and that's interesting because I want to go to one of the passages, and that's passage 59, where it says, Sophia, or wisdom called barren, void, was in fact the mother of prophets and angels. Women disciples followed Yeshua. Mary Magdalene was his close disciple and companion. Some disciples felt Rabbi Yeshua loved her the most. They noted he often kissed her. And I like that because in a lot of translation, it does say he kissed her in the mouth, and you decided to take that out. So tell us about this passage, and also why do you decide to use the word Yeshua and Rabbi Yeshua in your translation?
Well, I decided a long time ago to use Yeshua because, just to be honest, the first time I'd come across that word was years ago when I first read the Gospel of Thomas by Jean-Yves Laloux. And I liked, he brought up this was how his name sounded, or this is closer to the way his name sounded to his own people, and that appealed to me at that time. I've since actually there was a gentleman I don't know why he did this, but he claims to have to be able to say in archaic Aramaic how Jesus' name was actually said, and he says, and this sounds very strange, but he says Jesus would have turned around if he'd said his name this way, Isho. Now that sounds
yeah, he would have
right. You would have said Isho. I mean, if you said Yeshua, that's Jewish from Well, I can't pronounce it, but from Joshua in Jewish, like Josh from Joshua, so to speak. but in fact, in Aramaic, if you were to say Jesus, it would be something close to this. This is what it sounded to me, and I looked it up phonetically, Isho, and as the Messiah would be Hamashika, which sounds pretty strange too. So I just want to note that because I was slightly embarrassed to find out that Yeshua wasn't the end of the matter.
It's a first to me. A lot of translations have Jesus kissing Mary on the mouth, and of course that brought all the sensationalistic Holy Blood, Holy Grail, Da Vinci Code, and all that. You decided to take that out.
Yeah, it's funny. I'll admit something here. First of all, I thought, well, maybe I'll put that in there. It's a little salacious. Make the book a little more exciting.
But it's not, because, I mean, a kiss, and even there's something in the text about kissing it's a form of transferring gnosis. It's a form of transferring information.
Yes, it is used, and in that manner. It's also, I believe it was even before, even in the canonical literature or the non-Nag Hammadi literature, there's the kiss of peace. I think the Apostle Paul says the actual words,
right.
Give the kiss of peace, or I'm not exactly sure the wording he used, but it's close to the kiss of peace, which was, I'm sure was, on the head, on the cheek, might have been on the mouth, but it wasn't you didn't grab the person, bend them over, and give them a big kiss.
It wasn't Gone with the Wind or anything like that.
No, and I remember I was still actually teaching at that time, driving into L.A. And I remember when the Da Vinci Code came up, and I enjoyed the film greatly, but I had already read enough about the Gospel of Philip that I knew that in the actual papyrus, it's either papyrus or vellum. I think it's papyrus, but in whatever they have, which is hooked to the Gospel of Thomas, and it starts on the last page of the Gospel of Thomas, which may not be significant. I take it as slightly significant, but when you get to the word kissed her on, there's a hole in the actual papyrus or vellum, whichever it's made of. I can't remember right at the moment. There's a hole. So kissed her on is blank. You don't know what. If you kissed her on the cheek, kissed her on the head, kissed her on the mouth, everybody makes their choice. It's interesting that Patterson Brown, who strikes me as in ways conservative, chose to say mouth too. I went back and forth on this, and I finally decided that I was going to just put down what seems silly, because I've admitted I've done a little bit of eisegesis, but nevertheless, I decided I would just say kissed her, and then leave it up to the individual reader to decide what that means. He does, in the next verse, of course, talk about how she must have been wise, or he implies that she was a very wise woman. And of course, in Pistis Sophia, I think she's, or is it Mary Magdalene?
Right, it is.
Well,
yes.
I get the two mixed up a little bit, and that's not totally my fault. The writers mixed up those two eventually over time, Sophia and Mary Magdalene. But if we look at the Da Vinci Code, that is, I guess, where they the way I took what they did is he interpreted the ritual of the bridal chamber, one of the five sacraments, or five most important sacraments in Gnosticism, as I understand it, in the Gospel of Philip. The way they showed it in the Da Vinci was kind of the leader was like a holy prostitute, or
the sex magic cult leader has sex with his female disciples.
Right, and I think that's what they actually, what Dan Brown actually wrote in his textbook. I think that's what he was alluding to, that very phrase meant kiss her on the mouth, and take it a little bit further, and it's sacred sex. And I think people that are not do not like Gnosticism for whatever reason, that type of thing is thrown in my face. I have a very good friend. Now he's actually my son's friend. My two sons went to the University of Alabama. That's a whole other story. It's because we were living in Africa at the time, and I won't go into it. But they have a friend who's become he's trained to become a pastor. He's finishing up his master's degree. I'm not quite sure what he's going to do afterwards, but I was sitting at a barbecue with him, and I brought up that I enjoyed reading Gnostic literature and was very involved in it. And his reaction was extremely hostile. It was, I was taken aback. I was taken aback that he was so offended that I would look at this Gnostic literature, and that I would even bring it up that I found some of it interesting and moving. Offended this friend of my son's. Now, I don't want this to be misunderstood. That this young man is really a nice guy, a wonderful person. He's good friends with my sons, and I just decided I would not bring up that the topic of Gnosticism with this seminary student, and so I don't anymore, because I think my sons have a right to maintain their friendship with this person that they all went to the University of Alabama together, and they're good friends, and I just stay away from that topic. But I've had that reaction a few times. Most of the time I don't have that type of an intense reaction, but that was quite a reaction.
Yes, understandable, and I certainly have been there. But I think the point is, again, we have Sophia Wisdom in the Gospel of Philip. We have a reverence for Mary Magdalene as, again, not as some sort of sultry girl, but really as a main disciple or important disciple of Jesus Christ. So that tells us, at the very least, what was going on in the late 2nd century with Christianity. These ideas were there and they were valid. So I don't see what the problem is, because what we're doing is we're reading history, if anything. So tell us, James, tell us about some of the sayings that speak to you or that you want to share to the audience that might be different from other translations, or what you added to them to make it more meaningful or more powerful.
Well, let me think here. We could take verse 5. This should speak to anybody who has sensitivity to the writings about Jesus. So here I'll read the verse the way I wrote it. He showed us the kingdom, the city of God, decorated with light, filled with compassion and love. It is the heaven above heaven, and the paradise in the all in all. In that place, death is no more. Life is eternal and in repose, and we look upon the face of God. Now, that's verse 5 as I've written it out. I chose to use the word kingdom. I suppose, in a way, I like a little bit of King James language at times. And I also tried to write this out so that there was, this verse would move anybody who had has Christian background, and also there's a little bit of Gnosticism in there as I interpret it. So I like the concept. It is the heaven above heaven, just as you have on your, I believe it's your website, the God above God.
Right.
I like these concepts very much, because they, strangely enough, they remind me of science. And a lot of people would find that a strange statement to make, but one of the things that I found out about science, because I actually did science, I wasn't someone who read about science. I actually had to design, get grants, train people, pick outcome measures, and then do the best I could to make sure that the patients were not unblinded, and and conducted actual research. The longest trial that I did, we probably saw patients for about a year, a randomized clinical trial. But I had done also randomized controlled trials. And so I actually did science. And so I would see the paper that I'd written, and had written in conjunction with other scholars, particularly one other PhD, the dean, my very good friend. And we would know one thing would be the paper we'd present to, for example, Archives of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation. That would be the paper, and that would be everything brought together and stuck in one spot so that everybody could take a look at it and see how well it was done and how well the bias was ruled out, and what we had to say and what were the outcomes after 6 months of treatment and so forth. And then there was also what we knew about what actually happened, and it's kind of like Gnosticism in a way. There's something on the surface, you see what's on the surface, but what's underneath is an unbelievable depth. And so for me, these things remind me of this, of some of my experience in actually doing science, not just talking about science, not just watching something on TV about science, but having actually done science. This may be one of the reasons why Gnosticism appeals to me, because God above God, that's a concept that makes a lot of sense to me, because we think we know something. And I could say the same thing about science. I thought, for example, that I knew such and such a treatment could do such and such a thing. But it was only after I had done an enormous amount of reading and study, and then actually designed, ran, and completed a randomized controlled or clinical trial, that I finally came to realize that I didn't know hardly anything. What the outcome was, I was not sure of. I was not sure that what I had believed prior to doing the research was going to be the outcome that we got when the research was done. So, for example, I did a trial on treating chronic ankle sprain. And it was actually the first, what we call manual therapy, randomized controlled trial of treatment of chronic ankle sprain ever done in the history of medicine by anybody, before physical therapists, physiatrists, before orthopedists, before anybody, or osteopathic physicians and so forth. So it was the very first trial. And we did it, and as I did it with my with the master's student that I had at the time, a wonderful young man named Justin Pello, I realized I didn't know what was going to happen. I was more sure of what was there before I did the trial than when we did the trial. Then when we did the trial, I sweat bullets. What I should say is I wanted a certain outcome, but we had set it up in such a manner, and this is what science tries to do. We had set it up in such a manner to try and rule out as much bias as possible, which we did. The outcome in this case, not in every case, but in this case, to my great joy, turned out to be good. It really did help this group of chronic ankle patients chronic pain in patients that have suffered an ankle sprain. They were greatly helped, and in the follow-up, they continued to be helped. And however, immediately after this, it seemed like all the different professions that treat that type of disorder did similar types of studies. And I found myself, once again, very nervous about what they would find. Now, since that time, this was done in 2001, this one study I'm talking about. It was done before the two towers were hit. But I have waited, and I've done other trials on the ankle since that time. I'm not doing trials now. I'm retired and everything, but I waited to see what everybody else would find. I was actually quite nervous. Would this hold up or not? There's probably been, since 2001, 50 trials. And almost virtually all of them have found the same thing. They found increased movement of the ankle that's usually up, or what we call dorsiflexion. The tip of the toe can go up higher towards the head. And also they have faster relief of pain. And this has been repeated over and over and over and over and over again. So this thing I thought I knew, and then we set up, and then I wasn't so sure, and then we did it, and I was very happy with the outcome, but then I was nervous what other people would find. But now it's been these years later. Here it is, 2017. We did that in 2001. Now it's 2017, close to 2018. And like I said, there's probably been 50 larger trials, very longer trials, and they found, to my great joy, because my dad was a podiatrist, by the way, it's a foot doctor, it does produce this effect over and over and over again. So, and the wonderful thing about this is, here's a way to get pain relief, and you don't have to take drugs. But I didn't mean to get on the air with you to talk about this thing. I'm retired. I'm not trying to push myself or practice or anything else. I'm trying to tell you why Gnosticism moves me. And it's because of some of my own experiences in life, one of those being what's on the surface is certainly doesn't tell us often what is behind it and the depth of what's behind it. And it's the same in science for me too, in physics. You see one thing, but if you take microscopic physics, smaller than an atom, what's called quantum physics, you know that we don't know why things are the way they are exactly. So all of this has made, I think, the Gnostic literature more meaningful to me. You don't have to have that background to find this literature interesting. I just kind of, for some reason, took a leap there. So that gives you a little idea of the way my mind works.
No, I think it makes perfect sense, James. It seems the idea of gnosis can work in science. And, of course, the Gospel of Philip does say ignorance is slavery, knowledge is freedom. All of us really need to find out something when there is a call. And you had that call for the Gospel of Philip. And like the Gnostics, you wrote your own gospel. I think the Gospel of Philip also says ignorance is the mother of all sins. So it's good to see this attitude in different places. I think that's all the time we have today, James. I'd like to thank you very much for coming on Aeon Byte and discussing your new and wonderful book, The Gospel of Philip, A New Translation.
It's been a pleasure to talk with you, Miguel. I'm honored.
And there you have it, oh you Aramchick Avengers. The first part of our interview with Dr. James Brantingham from his new book, The Gospel of Philip, A New Translation. Moondog Vance couldn't join us as he was doing a musical gig, but I'm sure he'll be back in our next media sacrilege. In our second part, we delve into more sayings and interpretations of the Gospel of Philip, including some of the more touching ones having to do with love and faith. And we discuss the saying about how God should worship men. James also provides a powerful take on being attached to the world versus being attached to the Spirit, how the Gnostics saw rebirth and resurrection, the nature of the soul, and so much more. Inspiring content waiting for you in our second part. Yes, and as always, only $5.99 a month to join, complete and not partial shows, access to 11 years of work and more than 375 episodes. You'll get your own private RSS feed where you can listen to all complete shows on the podcatcher of your choice. You'll also be invited to our Inner Sanctum of Gnosis Facebook group, where we are building a community of mystics, madmen, and sages. And James will be there for a Q&A on the show. And many past guests hang out there like Robert Price, Andrew Phillip Smith, Sean Martin, Robin Robertson, Tim Freak, and more. You get the same benefits if you become a patron at Patreon, except you get early shows. If anything, please assist with a few shekels here and there via PayPal or the US mail. Let's keep this Red Pill Cafeteria open, and let's keep that blasphemous content coming for the rest of 2017 and the full 2018. I can't do it without you. Much appreciation for those of you who support on a weekly basis. This show comes out as the holiday season begins, and it's a hard time for many. But the rules haven't changed from my introduction. It's the same game, even if the Archons turn up the lights and the materialism. It's all about ignoring all this fake light and finding your inner light and being the legend maker and going into and beyond the cold seasons. Don't despair. Don't worry. The game is the same. You will be amazed when the miracle of your gnosis begins. Hang in there. Fight the good fight, keep the faith, and finish the race. I'll be with you every step of the way as you are with me. Hello and goodbye as always.